Sometimes saving a stranger costs everything you've ever built, and sometimes it's the only way to find who you really are. If you're ready for a tale of honor, sacrifice, and the price of doing what's right in the unforgiving Old West, hit that subscribe button and let's ride into this story together. The year was 1887, and the territory of New Mexico stretched like a canvas of endless dust and broken dreams. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell had worn his badge for 15 years, watching Copper Ridge grow from a handful of tents to a town that almost resembled civilization. His weathered hands had drawn his Colt .45 in defense of justice more times than he cared to count, and his graying temples told the story of a man who'd seen the worst of humanity and still chose to stand between the innocent and the wolves. The town respected him, feared him when necessary, and trusted him completely. His small adobe house sat at the edge of town, where the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain that rarely came. Caldwell had built his reputation on being predictable, fair but firm, slow to anger but deadly when crossed. He'd never married, claiming the badge was wife enough for any man in these parts. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as the sun painted the mountains copper and gold, Sheriff Caldwell would make a decision that would test every principle he'd ever held dear. The stranger who would change everything was already riding toward Copper Ridge, carrying secrets that could burn the town to ashes or forge it into something stronger than steel. The sound of approaching hoofbeats would soon echo through the narrow streets, and with them, the beginning of the sheriff's most dangerous journey, not across the desert, but into the depths of his own conscience, where the lines between right and wrong blur like heat waves on the horizon. The man who rode into Copper Ridge looked like trouble wrapped in torn clothes and desperation. His horse was lathered with sweat, its flanks heaving from what had clearly been a hard ride through the desert. The stranger himself bore the marks of recent violence, a split lip, bruised knuckles, and eyes that darted constantly to the horizon as if expecting pursuit at any moment. Sheriff Caldwell watched from his office window as the man dismounted outside Murphy's saloon. There was something about the way he moved, careful and calculated, that spoke of military training or perhaps something darker. His clothes were quality once, now dust-covered and torn, suggesting a fall from better circumstances. The holster on his hip was empty, but the leather was worn smooth from years of use. When the stranger caught sight of Caldwell's badge through the window, his whole body tensed like a cornered animal. For a moment, their eyes met across the dusty street, and the sheriff saw something he'd learned to recognize in 15 years of law enforcement, the look of a man running from his past, carrying secrets heavy enough to break his back. The stranger quickly averted his gaze and pushed through the saloon's batwing doors, but not before Caldwell noticed the way his right hand instinctively moved to where his gun should have been. Old habits die hard in the Old West, and this man's habit spoke of violence and survival in equal measure. As the sheriff reached for his hat, preparing to introduce himself to Copper Ridge's newest visitor, a cloud of dust on the eastern horizon caught his attention. Riders, moving fast and with purpose. The stranger's past, it seemed, was about to catch up with him. But what happened next would force Sheriff Caldwell to choose between the safety of his town and the life of a man he'd never met. The dust cloud resolved into 6 hard-faced men riding like the devil himself was on their heels. Sheriff Caldwell recognized the type immediately: bounty hunters, mercenaries, or worse. Their leader was a giant of a man with a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, riding a black stallion that seemed to share its master's mean disposition. From his office, Caldwell could hear the stranger inside Murphy's saloon frantically asking about the back exit. The bartender, old Murphy himself, was shaking his head. There was no back way out of that building. The stranger was trapped, and he knew it. Through the window, Caldwell watched as the man's shoulders sagged with the weight of inevitability. The 6 riders thundered into the main street, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that made the afternoon air thick and choking. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this many times before. 2 positioned themselves at either end of the street, cutting off escape routes, while the others dismounted with weapons already drawn. The scarred leader stepped onto the saloon's porch, his spurs ringing against the weathered wood like a death knell. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the street with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We know you're in there, McKenna. Time to pay what's owed." McKenna. The name meant nothing to Sheriff Caldwell, but the fear in the stranger's eyes meant everything. As the bounty hunters prepared to storm the saloon, Caldwell faced the first of many impossible choices that day. He could stay in his office, let justice, or vengeance, take its course, and keep his town safe from whatever storm was about to break. But something in his gut, honed by 15 years of reading men's souls, told him this wasn't justice at all. Sheriff Caldwell's hand hovered over his gun belt as he watched the scene unfold. 15 years of wearing the badge had taught him to read situations quickly, and everything about this felt wrong. Legitimate law enforcement didn't corner men like predators hunting prey. These weren't lawmen. They were something far more dangerous. The stranger, McKenna, had pressed himself against the saloon's interior wall, visible through the window. His lips were moving in what might have been a prayer or a curse, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who'd run as far as he could run. But there was no cowardice in his posture, only the grim acceptance of a man preparing to make his last stand. Old Murphy had retreated behind his bar, and the few afternoon drinkers had scattered like tumbleweeds before a storm. The saloon had become a trap, and everyone knew it. Outside, the scarred leader was giving his men final instructions, dividing them into positions that would ensure no escape and no mercy. Caldwell's conscience warred with his practical mind. He had a duty to his town, to the people who trusted him to keep them safe. Getting involved in whatever this was could bring violence and chaos to Copper Ridge's peaceful streets. But he also had a deeper duty, one that had nothing to do with badges and everything to do with the kind of man he'd chosen to be. The weight of his Colt .45 seemed heavier than usual as he stood up from his desk. Through the window, he saw McKenna's reflection in the saloon's mirror, and for a moment, their eyes met again. This time, the stranger didn't look away. Instead, he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging that whatever came next, he was ready to face it like a man. But Sheriff Caldwell was about to ensure that whatever came next wouldn't be what anyone expected. Sheriff Caldwell stepped out of his office with the deliberate calm of a man who'd made his choice and would live with the consequences. His boots echoed against the wooden sidewalk as he walked toward the saloon, each step measured and purposeful. The afternoon sun caught the silver of his badge, throwing its reflection across the dusty street like a challenge to the gathering storm. The scarred leader noticed him first, turning from the saloon's entrance with predatory awareness. "This ain't your concern, Sheriff. We're here on legitimate business." His voice carried the kind of confidence that came from having superior numbers and no conscience to slow him down. "In my town, everything's my concern," Caldwell replied, his voice carrying 15 years of authority. He could feel the eyes of hidden townspeople watching from behind curtains and through cracks in doors. Whatever happened here would be remembered and retold for years to come. "You boys got papers? Warrants? Anything that says you can come into Copper Ridge and terrorize my citizens?" The bounty hunters exchanged glances, and Caldwell read their silent communication like words on a page. They hadn't expected interference from local law enforcement. Most sheriffs in these parts knew better than to get between wolves and their prey, especially when the wolves traveled in packs. Inside the saloon, McKenna had moved to a position where he could see the street. His face showed surprise at the sheriff's intervention, followed quickly by something that might have been hope. But hope was a dangerous thing in the Old West. It could make a man careless, or it could give him the strength to fight when all seemed lost. The scarred leader's hand drifted toward his gun, a movement so subtle it might have been unconscious. But Sheriff Caldwell caught it, and his own hand settled on his holster with practiced ease. The street had gone silent except for the whisper of wind through the buildings and the distant sound of horses shifting restlessly in the afternoon heat. The moment balanced on the edge of a knife, waiting for someone to make the wrong move. "The man's a killer, Sheriff," the scarred leader said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man stating obvious facts. "Murdered 3 men down in El Paso, including a woman and child. We're bringing him back to face justice." He reached slowly into his vest and produced a crumpled wanted poster, holding it up for Caldwell to see. The paper was weathered and stained, but the face drawn in rough charcoal was unmistakably McKenna's. The reward amount made Caldwell's eyebrows rise. $500 was more money than most people in these parts saw in 5 years. Below the image, the charges were listed in stark black ink: murder in the first degree, 3 counts. But something about the poster troubled the sheriff. The paper was too new for the crimes listed, the ink too fresh. In 15 years, he'd seen enough genuine wanted posters to know the difference between official law enforcement documents and something hastily created to justify violence. The scarred man was lying, but proving it would cost precious time they didn't have. From inside the saloon, McKenna's voice carried through the batwing doors, hoarse with desperation and surprising dignity. "Sheriff, don't believe what they're telling you. I never killed any woman or child. These men work for someone who wants me dead for what I know, not what I've done." The scarred leader's patience was wearing thin, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt. "We've got 6 men and legal justification, Sheriff. You've got a badge and good intentions. Do the math." His men began to spread out, their movements casual but purposeful, creating angles that would make any gunfight short and decisive. Sheriff Caldwell felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. He could step aside, let these men take McKenna, and probably watch an innocent man die. Or he could stand his ground, likely get himself killed, and leave Copper Ridge without protection. But as he looked at the wanted poster again, he noticed something the scarred man had missed, a detail that changed everything. The date on the wanted poster was wrong, 3 weeks in the future. Sheriff Caldwell's trained eye caught the mistake immediately, and with it, the entire fabrication crumbled. These men weren't bounty hunters or lawmen. They were hired killers with a story designed to keep local authorities from interfering with their work. "Interesting poster," Caldwell said, his voice deceptively calm as he stepped closer to examine it. "Especially considering these crimes supposedly happened next month." He tapped the date with his finger, watching as the scarred leader's confidence flickered for just a moment before hardening into something more dangerous. The mistake hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Around the street, the bounty hunters, or whatever they really were, shifted their positions, realizing their deception had been exposed. The pretense of legal authority was gone, leaving only the raw mathematics of violence that the scarred man had mentioned. Inside the saloon, McKenna had heard every word, and his reflection in the mirror showed a mix of gratitude and terror. He knew, as they all knew, that exposing the lie had made the situation infinitely more dangerous. Men with badges might hesitate to gun down a sheriff, hired killers had no such compunctions. The scarred leader's smile was cold as winter wind. "Sharp eyes, Sheriff. Too sharp for your own good." His hand moved to his gun in a gesture that was no longer subtle. "Makes no difference now. We came here to kill McKenna, and we're not leaving without finishing the job. You can die with him or walk away and live to sheriff another day." The choice was stark and final. Sheriff Caldwell could feel the weight of his badge, the responsibility to his town, the 15 years of careful reputation hanging in the balance. But he could also feel something deeper, the voice of conscience that had kept him wearing the badge when lesser men had hung theirs up and walked away. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the mountains, and the first drops of the promised rain began to fall. The first shot shattered the afternoon silence like breaking glass. Sheriff Caldwell had drawn and fired in the same fluid motion that had kept him alive for 15 years, his bullet taking the scarred leader in the shoulder and spinning him around like a child's top. The street exploded into chaos as the other 5 men scattered for cover, their guns barking death across the dusty ground. McKenna burst through the saloon doors, a borrowed rifle in his hands, old Murphy's hunting piece, probably loaded with more rust than gunpowder. But his movements were those of a trained soldier, and his first shot dropped one of the bounty hunters before the man could find adequate cover behind a water trough. The sheriff rolled behind a wooden barrel, feeling splinters explode around him as bullets chewed through the weathered wood. Across the street, townspeople were slamming shutters and barricading doors, the sound of their panic mixing with gunfire to create a symphony of frontier violence that would echo in Copper Ridge's collective memory for generations. Rain began falling in earnest now, turning the dust to mud and making the wooden sidewalks slick as ice. The storm had arrived with perfect timing, as if the desert itself had decided to wash away whatever blood was about to be spilled. Lightning split the darkening sky, illuminating the battlefield in stark black and white snapshots of desperate men fighting for their lives. The scarred leader, wounded but far from finished, had taken cover behind a horse trough and was directing his remaining men with hand signals. They were professionals, moving with coordinated precision despite the chaos. Sheriff Caldwell realized with growing dread that he and McKenna were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in the middle of the street with nowhere to run. As thunder crashed overhead like the sound of God's own artillery, Caldwell caught McKenna's eye across the battlefield. The stranger nodded grimly, understanding passing between them without words. They were going to die here, in the mud and rain of a New Mexico street, fighting for principles that most men had long since abandoned. But at least they would die as men, standing upright and facing their enemies. Between volleys of gunfire, as both men reloaded behind their meager cover, McKenna shouted over the storm, "Sheriff, there's something you need to know." His voice carried a desperation that went beyond their immediate danger, speaking of secrets that had driven him across half the territory with killers on his trail. "These men work for Colonel Harrison Marsh." McKenna continued, naming a man whose reputation stretched from Texas to California. Marsh was a cattle baron, a politician, and rumored to be much worse, a man who'd built his empire on the bones of anyone who'd stood in his way. "I used to work for him, until I found out what he really does with those government contracts." A fresh barrage of bullets forced McKenna to duck lower, but he pressed on with his revelation. "He's been selling weapons to Apache war parties, Sheriff. U.S. Army rifles, ammunition, even cavalry sabers. Then he turns around and sells protection to the same settlements the Apaches attack." The implications hit Sheriff Caldwell like a physical blow. If McKenna was telling the truth, then Colonel Marsh wasn't just a criminal, he was orchestrating a war that had already claimed hundreds of lives across the territory. The attacks on isolated ranches, the mysterious increase in Apache raids, the government's inability to track down the source of the Indians' modern weapons, it all made horrible sense. Lightning illuminated McKenna's face, showing the haunted look of a man who'd discovered evil beyond his capacity to understand. "I found his records, Sheriff. Names, dates, locations. I was going to take them to the territorial governor, but Marsh's men found me first." The scarred leader's voice cut through the rain and gunfire. "Time's up, McKenna. Give us those papers and maybe we'll make it quick." So that was what this was really about, not vengeance or justice, but silencing a witness to crimes that could topple one of the most powerful men in the territory. Sheriff Caldwell felt his resolve harden like steel in a forge. Some fights were worth dying for, and this had just become one of them. Through the chaos of gunfire and storm, an unlikely partnership was forged in blood and desperation. Sheriff Caldwell and the stranger McKenna fought as if they'd been partners for years, covering each other's movements with instinctive precision. When the sheriff's ammunition ran low, McKenna tossed him a handful of cartridges. When a bounty hunter flanked McKenna's position, Caldwell's shot sent the man diving for better cover. The rain had turned the street into a muddy river, and both sides were struggling with weapons that misfired in the wet conditions. But the bounty hunters still held numerical superiority, and they were beginning to close the net around the two defenders. The scarred leader, his wounded shoulder wrapped in a makeshift bandage, coordinated his men's movements with deadly efficiency. "Sheriff," McKenna called out during a brief lull in the firing. "My horse. Saddlebags." He gestured toward his mount, which had taken shelter in the narrow alley between the general store and the barber shop. "The evidence is there. If we don't make it, at least someone might find it." The documents that could expose Colonel Marsh's crimes were tantalizingly close yet impossibly far. Any attempt to reach them would mean crossing open ground under the guns of 4 remaining killers. It would be suicide, but it might also be the only chance to ensure that McKenna's death, and potentially Caldwell's own, would serve some greater purpose. Lightning crashed again, closer this time, and in its brief illumination, Sheriff Caldwell saw something that changed the entire equation. At the far end of the street, barely visible through the sheets of rain, a group of riders was approaching. More of Marsh's men, coming to finish the job? Or perhaps, the sound of familiar voices carried through the storm, and Caldwell's heart leaped with desperate hope. "Deputy Martinez, old Doc Peterson, even the bartender Murphy, his townspeople had armed themselves and come to help their sheriff. The odds were about to change dramatically, but the question remained, would they arrive in time to make a difference, or would they simply become additional casualties in Colonel Marsh's war against the truth? The sound of approaching hoofbeats and familiar voices filled Sheriff Caldwell's heart with a mixture of pride and terror. His townspeople, men he'd protected for 15 years, were riding into what could easily become a massacre. But as the first of them appeared through the rain-soaked street, he saw determination in their faces that matched his own. Deputy Martinez led the group, his young face set with grim resolve. Behind him rode Doc Peterson, clutching an ancient shotgun that probably hadn't been fired since the Mexican War, and Murphy, the Irish bartender, wielding a rifle with the confidence of a man who'd learned to shoot during harder times in the old country. A dozen other men followed, shopkeepers and ranchers united by loyalty to their sheriff and fury at seeing their peaceful town turned into a battleground. The scarred leader saw them coming and shouted orders to his remaining men. But panic was beginning to crack their professional composure. They'd signed on to murder one man and intimidate a small-town sheriff, not to fight a war against an entire community aroused to righteous anger. McKenna, seeing the tide beginning to turn, made his desperate dash for the saddlebags containing the evidence against Colonel Marsh. Bullets kicked up mud around his feet as he dove and rolled, finally reaching his horse and pulling out a leather portfolio wrapped in oiled cloth. "I've got them," he shouted, holding the documents aloft like a battle flag. The bounty hunters, outnumbered and outgunned now, began a fighting retreat toward their horses. But the scarred leader wasn't finished yet. With the cold calculation of a man who'd lived by violence for too long, he raised his rifle and took careful aim, not at Sheriff Caldwell or McKenna, but at the oil lamp hanging outside Murphy's saloon. The shot shattered the glass, and burning oil splashed across the wooden sidewalk, immediately catching fire despite the rain. As flames began to lick at the buildings of Copper Ridge, the battle took on a new urgency. The scarred leader's message was clear. If he couldn't complete his mission, he'd burn the town to ashes rather than leave empty-handed. But Sheriff Caldwell and his allies were about to show him that some things were worth more than buildings, and some stands had to be made regardless of the cost. The fire spread with terrifying speed despite the rain, racing along the wooden sidewalks and climbing the walls of the buildings that housed Copper Ridge's dreams and memories. The scarred leader laughed through the smoke and chaos, his wounded face twisted with the malicious joy of a man destroying everything he couldn't possess. Sheriff Caldwell found himself facing an impossible choice that crystallized everything he'd ever believed about duty and sacrifice. He could pursue the fleeing bounty hunters and end the threat they represented, or he could organize the townspeople to fight the fire that was consuming their homes. He couldn't do both, and the scarred leader knew it. "Choose, Sheriff," the wounded man screamed over the roar of flames and storm. "Save your pretty little town or let us ride away to finish what we started. But you can't have both." His remaining men were mounting their horses, ready to escape into the desert where they could regroup and return another day with more guns and fewer scruples. But McKenna, clutching the evidence that could expose Colonel Marsh, made a choice of his own. He thrust the leather portfolio into Sheriff Caldwell's hands and drew his borrowed rifle one last time. "Get those documents to the territorial capital," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I'll buy you the time you need." The stranger who'd ridden into Copper Ridge looking for sanctuary had found something more valuable, a cause worth dying for and a man worth trusting with his life's work. As he stepped into the firelit street to face the scarred leader's gun alone, McKenna transformed from hunted prey into something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The final confrontation was brief and brutal. 2 shots echoed through the storm, barely audible over the thunder and the roar of flames. When the smoke cleared, both McKenna and the scarred leader lay motionless in the mud, their blood mixing with the rain that continued to fall on Copper Ridge's burning dreams. Sheriff Caldwell organized the townspeople into bucket brigades while the surviving bounty hunters disappeared into the desert like ghosts fleeing the dawn. The fire was contained before it could destroy more than a few buildings, but the real victory lay in the leather portfolio that McKenna had died to protect. The evidence was everything the stranger had claimed and more, detailed records of Colonel Marsh's weapons sales to Apache war parties, correspondence with corrupt government officials, and a list of planned attacks that could prevent dozens of future massacres. McKenna's sacrifice had given them the tools to stop a war that had already claimed too many innocent lives. Within a month, territorial marshals arrested Colonel Marsh at his ranch outside Santa Fe. The weapons pipeline to the Apache raiders was shut down, and the mysterious increase in attacks ceased almost immediately. The territorial governor personally thanked Sheriff Caldwell for his role in exposing the conspiracy, but the sheriff took no satisfaction in the praise. McKenna was buried in Copper Ridge's small cemetery, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross bearing only his name and the dates they'd been able to determine from his personal effects. The townspeople had wanted to add "hero" to the inscription, but Caldwell thought the stranger would have preferred the simple dignity of his name alone. On quiet evenings, when the desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, Sheriff Caldwell would sometimes visit that grave and think about the choices that define a man's character. McKenna had ridden into Copper Ridge as a stranger running from his past, but he'd died as something far more precious, a man who'd found his way home to honor and purpose. The badge felt lighter on Sheriff Caldwell's chest after that day, not because his duties had lessened, but because he'd learned something valuable about the weight of conscience versus the weight of courage. Sometimes saving a stranger doesn't cost everything you've built. Sometimes it reveals everything you've become. What choice would you have made in Sheriff Caldwell's place? Would you risk everything for a stranger's life? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more tales of honor, sacrifice, and the unforgiving justice of the Old West.